Okay, so we need to talk about EA Play. Specifically, we need to talk about Dead Space. Now, first things first, this video is unscripted. I wanted to get it out quickly, I wanted to get my thoughts down, I wanted to kind of engage with the community and see what everyone thought. So, if what I'm saying makes even less sense than usual, you'll know why. But you should still like and subscribe and share, because... just do it. Okay, so I love Dead Space. And it's because I love Dead Space that I feel like I needed to make this video. So for those who might not be aware, Dead Space is a science fiction, survival horror, third-person shooter that originally released in 2008 to massive critical and commercial acclaim. And while it still has its fair share of detractors here and there, it's generally pretty loved by the survival horror community. It was followed in 2011 with a probably slightly more action-focused, but still excellent in my opinion, Dead Space 2, which, again, is pretty beloved. Some people even think it's better than the first one. I think that's a topic for another video. But yeah, great sequel. And then in 2013, we got Dead Space 3, which is not completely without merit, but I think is the weakest of the original trilogy. I think it's generally considered the weakest. It felt a little bit like EA, who is the publisher of these games. We'll get into that in a little bit. But it felt like EA were kind of meddling a little bit by this point. They added a completely co-op campaign, which, you know, seemed a little weird for Dead Space. Dead Space 1, specifically, is about isolation. So it's a bit odd to have the whole game be a co-op shooter, but, you know, each their own. But they also increased the action again. So Dead Space 2 is more action-focused, and Dead Space 3 is even more action-focused than that. They added microtransactions for weapons and outfits and stuff. I wouldn't call it pay to win, but they could give you positive attributes and make the game a little easier for you, you know. There is a lot of good stuff in Dead Space 3, but it feels a little marred by publisher interference. It's also worth noting as well that EA had said at the time that Dead Space 3 needed to sell, I think it was around 6 million copies in order to warrant a sequel, in order to get a sequel, right? So if we wanted Dead Space 4, it had to sell 6 million copies or something around that mark. Which, for now, is insane, but for 2013 is even more insane, even from an established franchise. And Dead Space was a huge franchise, right? It had some spin-off games on the Wii, it had a couple of animes, books, everything you can think of, right? But even that was a big ask, and I think most fans, even the biggest fans, kind of knew it was not going to sell that many copies. At least initially, maybe over its lifespan, but not in its initial phase. So, sure enough, it came out, it did well, but it underperformed by EA's targets, and we thought that was kind of the end of Dead Space. All of these games were made by a studio named Visceral Games, owned by EA, and celebrated generally mainly for this series. After Dead Space 3, EA put them to work on various games. I think they made a Battlefield game and another shooter, but it just felt kind of like they weren't working on games that were in their wheelhouse anymore. And then ultimately in 2017, EA shut them down, and a bunch of people lost their jobs, as is usually the case in the games industry when studios get shut down. And also, it's worth noting at that time when they were shut down, they were in the midst of developing a third-person, microtransaction-free Star Wars action-adventure game in the Uncharted mold, which was even being headed up by Amy Hennig, who was the original director of Uncharted 1, 2, and 3. So this will be important a little later on. Anyway, generally Dead Space fans mourned the loss of Visceral and kind of assumed that the IP was probably pretty dead. Some ex-Visceral staff went to work at a studio named Striking Distance Studios, where work would begin on what is clearly shaping up to be a Dead Space spiritual successor named the Callisto Protocol, which is not out yet, but it's due for release at some point, I think it's next year. So a lot of Dead Space fans were waiting on the Callisto Protocol for their Dead Space fix. So now we arrive in 2021, where we've seen a bunch of survival horror franchises like Resident Evil, for example, flourish and find new levels of popularity with ground-up remakes of previous popular entries. They've sold millions, and they've brought in a whole new crowd of people, a whole new crowd of fans. So, sure as shit, after a bunch of rumors, we get to EA Play, and EA announced that we're getting a full ground-up remake of the first Dead Space for the new generation of consoles. This time made by another EA-owned studio, EA Motive. So when I first heard about this, I watched the trailer, I watched EA Play, I tweeted out that basically something felt wrong. I said I would probably play it and I'd probably end up enjoying it. You know, I love Dead Space, so, you know, more Dead Space. But something just felt off. And the more I think about it, the more I started to feel like it was something worth talking about. So the central question I've arrived at is this remake a valid endeavor by EA? And if not, why not? Because for some reason, it doesn't feel like a valid endeavor, right? So we've seen a bunch of sacred texts, right? Sacred gaming texts remade in recent years by other studios, by studios that didn't make the original, right? With great and acclaimed results. So Shadow of the Colossus, Demon's Souls. These are remakes by a new studio who didn't make the original, but they turned out great and everyone loved them. So what is it about this? Why does this feel more underhanded? And I think there's a variety of factors at play. Like, firstly, it feels kind of like EA kind of meddled a little bit with the Dead Space franchise by, enforcing microtransactions or multiplayer that really didn't feel valid. I mean, maybe that came from the devs themselves, but it just doesn't feel that way. And that kind of detracted, right? So having a co-op campaign, for example, kind of detracted from a lot of the central themes of the series, which in turn meant that Dead Space 3 wasn't as satisfying. And they set this lofty goal for sales, which I think everybody knew they wouldn't hit at least straight away. And then they closed Visceral Studios and a lot of people lost their jobs. Also, they shut down Visceral while they were making a third-person Star Wars adventure game with no microtransactions. But then EA-owned studio Respawn Entertainment made one a few years later with Jedi Fallen Order, and it was great. And it was massively critically and commercially acclaimed. And EA even marketed it by saying that it had no microtransactions after they'd kind of embarrassed themselves further with high-profile missteps and gambling mechanics in FIFA. And that, in fact, they're actually doing that with this as well. They're also saying to outlets like IGN that, don't worry, Dead Space Remake will have no microtransactions. So it kind of all feels like Visceral got shat on quite a lot. And now EA are kind of using Motive. And don't get me wrong, Motive are a very talented studio, and this is why I think the game will still be worth playing. But it feels like Visceral got the shitty end of the stick here. They didn't want a lot of the stuff that happened to them to happen to them. They wanted to make the Star Wars game. Respawn made it. And I'm not saying it would be the same game. Respawn probably did something completely different. But the point is, there was a market there for that kind of genre of game. I think the other reason that people might have a problem is that this is a remake. It's not a side story. It's not Dead Space 4, right? Or Dead Space : something else. It's a remake of the first game. A first game which many believe to be a masterpiece and still a sacred text. Many believe that that game is kind of unimprovable. Now, obviously it came out in 2008, which is some time ago, but it still feels a little too soon for a remake of Dead Space for me. Especially when it's still fresh in our memories that EA shut down Visceral, who were kind of the arbiters of Dead Space as a franchise, in 2017. Now, what's interesting as well is that several members of the Dead Space dev team, including the original Dead Space's director, has come out and said they can't wait to play it and congratulations, and they're in full support of it. And I don't want to create toxicity. That's not what this video is. That's not what I'm doing. But something feels off about this to me. It just doesn't feel like the right time. Maybe I'm just being overtly cynical. But I'm interested to know what you guys think. I want to know whether you're excited for this remake. I want to know whether you think it'll be any good. I want to speculate on how much of a remake it's going to be. Is it going to be... When we see in the trailer, right, some areas look the same, and it's only a teaser, but we see some areas. We see the Ishimura. So we know the base story is going to be the same, but how much do you think they're going to change? How are they going to stick to it? And if they really go off the beaten path, if they completely change it, then is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is that them desecrating the sacred nature of the original, or is it them making it their own? I don't know. But yeah, I just wanted to voice that something feels off about the fact that they're remaking this to me. And I don't want to be overtly cynical. We all know that EA have made their fair share of shitty decisions, and they have some egregious, business practices and treatment of staff, which is rife in the industry anyway. But taking all of that into account, I see people excited about this remake, and I'm sort of excited about it, but I'm also sort of cynical about it. So I just wanted to get a video out real quick and see what you guys thought. And maybe we can chat about it in the comments. Maybe I'll do a follow-up. Who knows? Maybe I'll cover this game on its way to release. But yeah, that's it for today, guys. Hope you enjoyed this random musing about Dead Space as a franchise and a brief history, and this sort of pondering on what this remake is, what it represents for EA, what it represents for remakes in general, what it represents for Dead Space, what it represents for survival horror. So yeah, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and please, please, please share subscribe, like, dislike. It all helps. And we're really, really trying to grow the channel. We're really trying to hit a bigger subscriber base so then we can hit Patreon and Discord and all that stuff. So thank you very much for listening. Stay safe. Catch you later.